County. Here today are a number of city and county officials that will help answer those questions and hopefully shed some light on the health ordinances, the proposed health ordinances. With us tonight from the city of Eau Claire, our City Council President, Terry Weld, City Manager, Dale Peters, City Attorney, Stephen Nick. From Eau Claire County, County Board Chair, Nick Smyer, County Administrator, Catherine Schaaf, and County Corporate Counsel, Tim Sullivan. I'm sorry, County Corporation Counsel, Tim Sullivan. And City County Health Department Health Officer, Health Director, Lisa Giese. The purpose of this informational meeting, welcome to all of you watching via WebEx, and to those of you who may be listening by phone. Thank you for taking time to join us this evening. We know there's been a lot of worry and confusion and emotion that's wrapped up in what's going on and perceptions around the local health ordinances. And the purpose of this meeting is to give voice to that and to give you information so that you can make a decision and form your own opinion about this approach. And thank you to those of you who submitted thoughtful questions for this meeting. This meeting is scheduled for about an hour, but it may go longer. And a number of the questions that we received were similar in nature. So you may not hear your question, asked word for word, but hopefully you'll be able to recognize the heart of your question and get the answers that you're looking for. We'll also try to answer questions as they come in on the Q&A box that's in the lower right of your screen. Audrey Berner is with me and will help monitor those questions. Just a reminder that today's conversation is about the local health ordinances, not the current or past health orders. So to help set the stage for our conversation tonight, we're going to start with a brief intro by the panelists and their subject matter experts. So we'll start first with Terry Weld, City Council President from Eau Claire, and Nick Smyer, County Board Chair. Can you explain for us what the goal is of these ordinances?
I think, Tess, we're having just some technical difficulties. I think that our meeting host has to share the presentation. So Bob, that should be in your email if you're able to pull it up.
Okay.
And Nick Smyer, this is Catherine. Nick Smyer is in the process of trying to join us. He has some technology issues.
Are we okay?
So what we wanted to start with, Terry, if you're able to kind of start, hopefully Nick will be with us, is what the goal of these ordinances is.
Yeah, again, creating some sort of playbook, for this community, and to use when working with community-wide local health orders. It offers us a process to answer questions. I don't know if they're on the screen there or not, but looking at questions like, when do we need health orders? When are they necessary, and why do we need them? Why write community level orders versus a state or national? What kind of data is needed to be able to make informed decisions and put these ordinances in place? When does the city council and our county boards meet and review an order? And what does enforcement look like in the event that it's necessary? Again, based around the intent and written ordinance. And then how long can our orders be in place once they're issued? And so those kinds of questions are answered in the ordinance, and again allow us to provide the information as best we can and as detailed as we can to the community.
Thank you. And just a reminder to our panelists, if you could make sure that you're muted unless you're going to be speaking tonight. So next we're going to turn to Tim Sullivan, County Corporation Counsel. Can you explain for us why these ordinances have been written?
First of all, if we're looking at why these have been written, what we would first of all look at is first of all that there is existing state law called 25203. It is the law that regulates the local health officer with regards to communicable disease. That law gives the health officer the authority to promptly take all measures necessary to prevent, suppress, and control communicable diseases. The local health officer may also do what's reasonable and necessary for the prevention and suppression of disease, may forbid public gatherings when deemed necessary to control outbreaks or epidemics, and shall advise the department of measures taken. That law has not changed. It's still on the books. These ordinances do not modify that law in any way. But what happened is that earlier this year, we had the decision come out of the Supreme Court. It's commonly known as the Palm decision. That decision called into question some of the authority of the health officers with regards to orders in communities. The questions that were raised were general orders of application issued by non-elected individuals. In the instance of the Palm case, it was the Secretary of the Department of Health Services. Lack of oversight or rulemaking authority by the legislature. And there was also a concern under 25225, which is a statute related to 25203. There was the ability to have misdemeanor criminal charges, including potential jail time. And so we are looking at that decision and creating an ordinance that takes into consideration the Palm decision and subsequent court decisions that have been decided earlier this year to create an ordinance at a local level that not only goes along with the language of 25203, but brings into consideration the restrictions that were expressed in the Palm decision and creates an authorizing ordinance essentially for the health director at a local level.
Thank you. And now we'll turn to Steve Nick, City of Eau Claire City Attorney. Can you tell us, kind of explain what this ordinance does do?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to try, Tess. Thanks for the question, and thanks to everyone tuning in to learn more about this important community issue. So there's been a lot of questions, uncertainty about what this ordinance does and what it doesn't do. Difficult for me to summarize all of that in just a couple slides, but I'm going to try to give a quick overview, and then we can come back to, I know we have a number of good questions. So if we can get to the next slide, which is what does this ordinance do? There it is. So some of the things it does is, most importantly, it establishes a local procedure or playbook on how we would get to an order of general applicability if and when we are in an emergency public health situation, such as the current pandemic. It does not tell us exactly what that outcome would be, but it establishes the important procedures of how we get from here to there. And that really helps. Even though there's uncertainty based on the uncertainty of the circumstances, knowing the procedure you're going to use provides stability not only to those within the system providing those orders, but also to the general public, knowing that we will use a consistent, fair process. This is a process ordinance that sets up a procedure to get to orders if and when they're necessary. It authorizes one specific tool in a broader statutory toolbook for response to a contagious disease. So general orders, things that look like laws that apply to all of us across the community, that's not the only response. There are other state law means of responding, such as specific isolation or quarantine matters if a specific person is sick, or outbreak issues that are specific to a location. And those are handled elsewhere in state law, but this This authorizes one tool that might be needed, such as orders of general applicability. Something like it's necessary because of a certain contagious health condition that we wear masks when we're indoors, or that we physically separate and create physical space for each other, or limit occupancy, those type of general applicability issues. It also requires very specifically that any such decisions of that type are based on local data, and further that local data is informed by best available science. On top of that, whatever those local metrics might be, or the current science, that information has to be provided to the public, so the public can evaluate those decisions themselves on the merits. They're not relying simply on the local health officer or any other official telling them simply what the order is, but they have to explain in some detail why they have found that that is necessary. Then with that information, it adds a critical element Tim Sullivan was referencing in his comments to respond to the decision of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, indicating that if you're going to make rules that look a whole lot like laws, you've got to make sure that they follow a process that we understand how we adopt those type of laws. And that is through a legislative process. And so while this ordinance does authorize prompt emergency response by a local health officer, equally, it keeps the legislative branch, our city council and our county board, engaged at every step of the way. If it doesn't have ongoing legislative support, those type of rules applying across the city can't continue. And finally, it respects and protects our constitutional rights and liberties. It recognizes that balance that we must take. It indicates that all measures will be used to limit the impact on specific businesses or classifications, and if and when they need to be used, they can't infringe upon constitutionally protected liberties. So those are the type of things that the ordinance does do. Let's take a look at some of the things it does not do. Next slide. Can I get there?
It's coming.
All right. It's not my screen, so I can't share it, but there's a good list of things it doesn't do. And unfortunately, one of the issues we've had is a lot of misinformation out there. So as we're switching over to the next slide, you know, this is one way to get information, and certainly a good one that we've gathered a group of individuals here to answer your questions. But beyond that, go and take a look at the city's website, the county's website, the city county health department's website. A lot of these type of questions are answered in all of those locations as well. So now that we have that next slide up, what does the ordinance not do that we've heard some folks think it might? It does not expand the scope of statutory authority. It is adopting that statutory authority and applying it locally, but does not expand it. And in fact, it provides additional legislative guideline and public input opportunities in that process. It does not apply often. Now, it's hard to say when we've all been dealing with this pandemic for the last 6 to 7 months in this country. However, that hadn't happened for a good century. But when it does happen, when emergencies happen, we, by policy of this ordinance, if adopted, are looking for prompt, professional, evidence-based response backed by legislative oversight and public information. But we do not expect that to happen often. This is not an ordinance drafted for the seasonal flu. It is drafted for the rare occurrence of a substantial threat to public health that is novel, for which we have limited immunity, not only as applicable to the current COVID-19 threat, but to future unknown public health threats. It does not continue mandatory orders if the legislative bodies locally don't want it to. So if the city council or the county board, after an order is put in place, even with these additional procedures and safeguards, disagree with that policy, as is their legislative right as the elected officials locally, and they think that it should be something else or not applicable at all, this ordinance makes clear that the city council or the county board can terminate any mandatory orders of that sort and make them simply advisory. The ordinance does not change state law. As referenced on the earlier slide, there are already existing state laws that deal with how to best handle some specific individual who's sick and may be contagious and put others at risk. And there's already statutory authority out there and a responsibility for the local health officer to respond if there's a specific outbreak at a specific location. Those are not affected in any way, either by enhancing or reducing those authorities for our local health officer. The ordinance doesn't make these orders or any orders last forever. There is specific time limitations. Certainly one of the comments that the city or that the Supreme Court had was a concern of the duration, how long some of these orders might last. And so this ordinance addresses that. It indicates that the standard should be 14 days, and that's the standard that we've been using since local orders have been initiated on this particular response. But this ordinance would say orders can be no longer than 30 days per order, at which point a reevaluation of local conditions and best available science would have to be applied. There can be a successive number of orders, but again, at any time, a city council or county board can review them and make them advisory. And more so, there's a hard stop that the ordinance puts in place. At 6 months, if not authorized to be extended, any orders would become advisory. If council or the county board sees fit to extend, they can't extend any longer than a year. After that, any remaining community-wide standards would have to be adopted as ordinance. And then the final thing that it does is it doesn't modify our community's approach to enforcement. And that approach, I know that our office holds, that the City County Health Department has followed, and I believe Tim Sullivan and his office approaches prosecutions with as well, is enforcement is the last step. What we are looking to accomplish, whether it's with local health officer orders or other matters of community safety, is we want to inform the population. We want to inform our local residents that it's in their best interest and the community's interest to follow these standards. If we have concerns, if there might be a violation, we utilize warnings, further education, and opportunities for voluntary compliance. Only if those problems continue, if there's not a good faith effort to comply, could there then be enforcement. And even if there is enforcement, it then is the responsibility after any citation by the local health officer or by her staff in the health department, it's then up to either me in my office or Tim in his office to prosecute those violations, and anyone receiving that citation has full due process or fairness rights to have a hearing and ultimately a trial before one of our circuit court judges in Eau Claire Circuit Court, ensuring individual fairness of application. Thanks again for the great question, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Steve. Our panelists will first answer questions that came in advance. But again, a reminder that if you have a question for the panel regarding the proposed ordinances, you can enter that in the Q&A box that's in the right of your screen. And again, Audrey is going to be monitoring those and helping us out with those questions as they come in. So just a reminder that this is a conversation about the proposed ordinance, which is a process for how future enforceable health orders of community-wide impact would be developed. And we've grouped the questions that have come in, we've grouped them into 4 main categories. First would be the health order versus the proposed ordinance, the question of why now and what got us here, Then the ordinance sort of nuts and bolts of it, including legislative oversight, and then lastly, enforcement. So we've touched on a lot of these topics, but we're going to kind of dig into it a little bit more and answer those specific questions that you've been sending in to us. So we'll start with the health order versus the proposed ordinance. So what is the difference between a local health order and the proposed ordinance? Steve or Tim, could you answer that?
Well, simply put, an order is a requirement to do something. For example, it would be limiting the number of occupants in a business. That would be an order of general application. An order for an individual may be an order for isolation or quarantine. What we're talking about now is an ordinance that's being created that sets essentially the parameters upon how the orders can be created, and it also creates a system of legislative oversight by the county board and the city council, and also sets parameters with regards to substantial procedure or substantive procedures and procedural safeguards for the creation of the ordinance. And then in addition to that, establishes that orders that are created are limited in length of time as set forth in this ordinance.
So it sounds like it sort of gives us a framework to work from, and it uses phrases like standards and procedures. Can you sort of explain what that would be or what that looks like?
Well, substantive safeguards and is one of the things that are going in here, and I have to put my glasses on here for a second. In the county version of it, it's found in 8.30.070, and it sets restrictions such as shall only impose such restrictions and requirements as are necessary based on a factual inquiry into the local circumstances to prevent, suppress, and control direct human health risks proximately related to a highly infectious, novel, or otherwise communicable disease. So it's limited in scope to type of order substantively that the health officer can issue. And it also requires that the orders be content neutral, non-discriminatory, avoid classifications, and shall be reasonable and necessary in scope and duration. Procedural safeguards, those are found similarly in the county order at 8.30.060. That requires the health officer to undertake an investigation. It requires the length of the order to be limited to 30 days, but can be renewed for 30-day periods. It requires the health officer to make a report to the county board regarding the local conditions and necessity of any requirements in the order at every held regularly scheduled county board meeting during the order. It requires the publication of a Class 1 notice in the newspaper when an order is issued, and also requires that there be a statement concerning the purpose, local conditions, scientific understandings, and other data required to be made available to the board, the health board, and also to the public.
Okay. And Lisa, can you maybe just sort of give us a reminder of, as far as a health order is concerned, the importance of a health order and the benefits of the health order, what we look to those for?
Yeah, thanks, Tess, and thanks everybody for being part of this discussion. Certainly a health order in the way that we're talking about it here, these general orders for the community as a whole, are a tool that frankly hasn't been used in Wisconsin at a local level in any recent history. It's a very unusual occurrence. Typically would happen at a state level, and I think people likely know that on this on this call. Very unusual and used in very specific circumstances where there's concern about spread of disease that isn't controlled by another simple tool or mechanism that is related to the individual person. So certainly examples like pertussis, that is, if a single person has pertussis and they stay home, we certainly have minimal spread of a disease. The difference with this and the difference in a general order is really using this very specific tool very rarely when the risk is high, the spread is great, and some specific things would make a difference in us having really negative outcomes for health in our community. The best thing that can happen with a good order is that we see low disease and low death and low hospitalization. So success is seeing little community impact or minimal community impact. The ordinance that's being proposed about how we write this type of order is really providing a frame, one that we've been using largely since this started. It is not fundamentally different from a substantive way from what we've been doing since the get-go in Eau Claire County since May. But it adds that really language around the how. So whoever's in my position and colleagues that I work with across the state, how do we walk through that, looking at big picture, what's the best thing that we can do to help our community in this situation? So the ordinance really is an example of how to make sure that we have a good, solid process for anything that may come along, even things that we can't predict right now.
Great, thank you. So moving on to the next category is the why now and the what got us here. If we could go into that a little bit more, maybe Steve, we've been going with this, going along with COVID-19, for a while now. Why is this ordinance being considered now, and why not sooner?
Yeah, thanks, Tess. Yeah, we certainly have been going on with it for a while, and while we may be done with the virus isn't done with us yet. So, we need to continue to stay vigilant, to continue to take action and add, as Lisa was just saying, necessary tools to the toolbox, as needed. And there is a local need here to respond, and potentially to respond with orders that can be locally enforced. Really going back to the issue of, this pandemic, this worldwide, viral contagious novel disease, at least in the United States, largely being dealt with on a local level. So, with something less than a complete response at a national or state level, municipalities, counties have been asked to respond. So specific to Wisconsin, we started in a response with either gubernatorial emergency orders or then Secretary Palm's orders. Those were challenged in the Wisconsin Supreme Court and struck immediately. Even though the parties had asked for some transition time, none was provided. Really, forcing the locals to, kind of pop the clutch on an emergency response and immediately, get out there and deal with that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so it's just sort of been kind of plopped in our laps locally to figure out how to.
Right, like any number of issues have. I mean, and then that's what we do at the local level. So whether it's a novel virus or the large fire, an environmental issue, law enforcement, public work issues, local governments serve that function even when state and national governments are responding. But in this case, at least in Wisconsin, it has largely been left at a local level to respond. Now we've we've still put a few months, behind us since May. What have we been doing since then? Well, quite a lot. Of course, there have been ongoing orders, and those orders have made a substantial positive difference in our community. And we've been adopting those through a variety of methods, namely at the city level, ongoing declarations of emergency that have dealt with it on, a short and intermediate term basis. But as we've been talking about, it's important as we move into unfortunately, the better, part of a year of this response before we see a potential for improvement, probably, a need to normalize that process, both for those of us in the emergency response and also for the public. So even in this very unusual time, there is some set standards of expectations, that there are specifics, at least specifics on the how, on the procedures. And in terms of getting to that, it's an ordinance and a process that needed to be drafted from the ground up. So we certainly learned from the Palm decision, and whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it's essential that if you want to make a positive effect locally or at a state level on a public health basis, we now have to understand the import of the Palm decision and also several subsequent judicial decisions that make clear that while there is statutory authority there, it needs to be coupled with legislative oversight. And so what this ordinance does in a purpose section is it says we get that balance, that challenging balance of wanting prompt emergency response while giving the public the greatest access possible to the information of why we're issuing those orders, why they're needed, and then a feedback loop through our legislative process. So those orders can be legal and consistent with our constitutional structure. We wanted to do our best to get that right. There are certainly policy choices to be made by city council and county board. It's not, this is the only option, but in terms of if we want to authorize our local health officer and the health department to respond in a professional evidence-based manner, this type of authorization ordinance with maintained legislative oversight is the means that we need to use to do so.
And so you sort of already touched on this, but is there anything more that you would like to add about why we even need one at all? What would happen if we didn't have one at all?
Well, first of all, I'd like to note that I believe under the rules of this debate, I get bonus points for answering in advance. No, never mind.
Sure.
In terms of what would happen if the policy choice is made not to do this, any orders by the local health officer would be advisory. We would not be able to enforce them to get to that higher level of compliance. We want people to follow these rules because they're in their own safety and the safety of everyone else. So, a lot of people, even if there's no citation, are going to stop at stop signs because they know they're in their own best interest, as well as the best interest of the motorist that might be coming from your right or left. But not everyone. And so sometimes, to get to that, 95, 99% compliance that we really need, to put a stop to this virus, or to greatly reduce its effect, we may need enforceable orders. To get there, we'd have to adopt the ordinance. If it's not, they're going to be advisory, and the only way we can get to an enforceable standard is either by the city council or the county board directly adopting an ordinance. And that is something they certainly can lawfully do. It is not as timely and responsive as an order.
Okay. And you've mentioned the word enforceable. You've used the word enforceable a couple of times. Is that something that that people have been giving you feedback on, that's something that they wanted? Is that it was somehow enforceable, that there was some sort of
Well, I spoke last, so you might be still asking me that question. I'll try to respond briefly, but it might be one that others want to jump in on. But yes, I have heard that either directly with feedback to me in my office or on comments that have been forwarded to me by council members or that I've seen through Incident Command and Health, that yes, that people are concerned about, while we have good understanding and compliance with the orders in our community, that it's not as universal as we'd like to see. and that enforcement in some cases might be needed.
Okay, thank you. And we'll move on to some of the nuts and bolts then. Some people are concerned that that these proposed ordinances are overreach, and they're concerned about whether or not, power is being given to unelected officials. Does this ordinance give the local health officer additional authority more than they already have? And you can speak to that, or Tim?
Well, I'll speak to that. In fact, it does just the opposite. It restricts the authority of the health officer. Right now, under the statute, at a state level, the health officer is authorized to do whatever is reasonable and necessary. That's, if you think about that language is wide open and really is sort of unrestricted language. Here we're saying, you can do an ordinance, or you can do an order, but you have to explain the reasons for that. You have to base it on scientific evidence. You have to base it on the local factors with regards to the communicable disease in the community. And then on top of that, you have to report that information to the city council and the county board. And the county board and the city council will have a chance to review that and determine whether or not it should be an effective ordinance or it should become advisory. And so to say that we're giving unrestricted authority to the health officer, I think, is just the opposite fact of what we're doing.
Tim, this is Audrey. There's a question in the chat box related to this, and the question is, aren't the phrases in the ordinance reasonable and necessary and best scientific evidence too vague for use in an ordinance, since they are extremely subjective? And you just touched on the fact that they are vague, but maybe you can talk about why they are that way in the ordinance as written.
Well, they're that way because what we do also have to do is rely upon our professionals, namely the health officer, to do her job in the manner that is appropriate. So reasonable and necessary is not going to apply the same in every particular situation. Today we have the COVID-19 pandemic that's affecting us. The next time it might be related to smallpox. I'll just pick something out of the air. Those factors are going to be different. And so it's the professionals that are dealing with this situation in the health department that are going to have to determine what is reasonable and necessary based on the scientific information, based on the facts in the community. So to limit it to just say that they rely on one source, ultimately could put the county, the city, the community at risk, because we wouldn't be taking into account the most up-to-date information, the information relevant for the particular pandemic or communicable disease.
So that's a question that came in.
Could I?
Oh, yep, go ahead, Steve.
I just wanted to jump in on that as well. Because I think it's important to respond to that sort of language very specifically. The ordinance is not vague. The standards are not vague. They are very specific. Tim read through them earlier. And what they do is, within those specific parameters, they grant necessary discretion. So discretion is not impermissible. In fact, we're very familiar with it in any number of our local responses. So again, I referenced the many other types of local provision of services. It is not concerning legally, and we are not concerned day to day that our fire chief or our fire officers have discretion when they respond during a time of emergency, or that our police officers do. When those things move into a longer term duration, as this ordinance recognizes, and they are going to be rules of general application, we still are frankly fine with discretion, but it needs to be in the form of legislative discretion through our elected officials. This ordinance maintains that necessary constitutional structure throughout, from day one, even though discretion is granted to those that are in the best position to respond in time of emergency for individual and community safety. At no time is there not legislative oversight and public information for an informed electorate to comment back to their county board members or city council members. And if at any time those bodies think that the direction is something different than is in the public welfare of the community as broadly defined by those elected officials, they can bring it up on the next meeting as quick as a 24-hour notice and change it. There's nothing vague about that. That is a very specific legislative appropriate process.
So another related question then, and Tim and Steve, I'll let you decide who'd like to take it. Someone's asking specifically, well, will this ordinance cripple the health department's ability to react quickly in the need of a crisis? And so maybe you can talk to that balance of being able to respond quickly when needed.
I'll take it and certainly welcome others to chime in, but exactly, it's a policy choice, but it's attempting to set that balance. And if the council or county boards see that the balance should be set differently, that is entirely within their discretion. But what this attempts to do is allow the prompt discretionary response within guidelines, within standards based on local evidence. And so that response still can be quick, that we still can have the same type of prompt response we expect in fire, police, or public works. And we certainly need in time of public health emergency from our trained professionals in the health department, and specifically the local health officer. So it does not delay that at all, but it is done under the continued legislative oversight. And so response can happen immediately based on evidence by the local health officer. But if it is moving in a direction that city council or county board doesn't agree with, there's also the very prompt ability to put it on an upcoming council meeting, ask good questions in a public setting about it. And if not satisfactory in their legislative judgment, they can change that to an advisory and no longer make it mandatory in the community.
So I think that's one of the things that a lot of people have been concerned about is being able to have that feedback. When you talk about legislative oversight, and you sort of touched on this already, again, we're talking about the city council and the county board, right? And that's what we're talking about, is those two groups, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then as far as an order being advisory, so what does that mean? What does that mean? That the health officer, if it becomes advisory, does the health officer then just say, we advise these things to protect their health, but they can't actually require us to do that?
Well, it essentially takes away the forfeiture aspect of the ordinance. That we would not be able to issue a citation. It's a recommendation from the health department then.
I have a related question in the chat box, and Lisa, I think that this might be a good question for you. The question is, why do you feel that advisory orders are not sufficient? So of course, if we go through the legislative process, then these would be required orders. So the alternative is, why not just allow advisory?
To answer that question, if everybody followed the recommendations of the health officer, an advisory order would be appropriate. But unfortunately, we know that some people are not going to follow all of the recommendations of the health officer. And as we discussed earlier, there has been some requests for enforcement within the community. And that's because people know that there are orders that are out there from the state, there are orders from the local health department, and they're still not following them, and they're putting other people at risk. And so there is, unfortunately, a need for enforcement in certain situations. And so that's why you have to have that enforcement capability.
And I would just add, from my local health department perspective, definitely as Tim shared, there are a small percent of situations where doing the right thing for our community is not something that happens by a very, very small percent of our population. And we as a health department, and I think as a community, have really high expectations for each other. And we care about our community. People in this county care about each other. And really, largely, advisories and recommendations are the way that the health department goes and supports. In those very small circumstances where that isn't working, having an order does give us an additional tool. And that tool helps protect the whole community. The risk in a disease like we have now, which is highly contagious, and other diseases where there may be an interest in a general order like we have currently, is really that there is a transmission of disease that we can do something about by having an order like this. So again, very rare. Again, to protect broadly the community. It's not just about me in this situation and what I do or do not want to do, but my choices have a broad impact on others, because this is a incredibly communicable disease and it's spread by people that may not have symptoms. So this is an example of the kind of disease that an order does make sense for, because it is very communicable. It's brand new. We haven't had this since, it started in January, and we're learning about how to treat it, how to prevent it. And in that time frame where we're doing that, we need to protect one another. So again, very rarely used, but an order does help us in situations, and community members have asked for this, where we can stop something from happening that is really risky to a broad group of people.
Yeah, I'd like to just quickly build on both those good answers also by noting, that you get to a certain level of compliance, and we usually hope a pretty high one with recommendations. But really, to get to the level that makes an impactful difference, we may need enforceable orders. And recent directives from the CDC indicate that mask wearing can have, in fact, as much or perhaps greater, the director indicated, an impact than an eventual hoped-for vaccine. But to be effective, it needs to be nearly universal. We all need to do it to have that be effective. And so to get to that level that protects not only the individual, but the community, we may need an enforcement ability. And we see that in any number of behaviors where we certainly ask for voluntary compliance, but until it's actually required, and until there's an understanding that there might be some enforceability behind that, you're not getting to the level of compliance. Like I said, using that same analogy of a stop sign, it's simply not good enough if 90% of the people stop at stop signs. We need to have an understanding that nearly all people will stop at stop signs for everyone's safety. And that's what enforceability gets you to.
So what would happen? Can you explain the approach to enforcement? Like, what will happen if someone violates or goes against a local health order after, these ordinances were adopted? What does that look like for people?
And I might just add, we have a specific question about how businesses would be impacted when it comes to this ordinance and enforcement.
Jim,
well, I think the first, try at that, and certainly others chime in as well. So, again, this would not be a new standard. Far from it in the community of, even a broad health and safety standard in the community. So businesses in particular would be familiar with restaurant safety, issues of, we were the first in the state to have a local smoke-free dining ordinance, for example. We have any number of housing or licensing requirements. All those types of safety requirements are, first of all, made known to the public, as this ordinance would require. If through general education on the standard. If that's not sufficient, we do outreach to specific individuals, making sure we get compliance, informing them of our efforts to ask them to at least make a good faith effort towards compliance. If those concerns continue, there'll usually be an order or notice to comply, and if they don't, there could be a citation. Or in the city, there could be implications on, say, their license to practice, their license to continue to operate, for example, as a restaurant or a tavern. And we have already put out letters. We've sent out letters to the tavern and restaurant community and our owners, indicating that what we're looking for is a good faith attempt to comply with any local orders. And as long as there is that partner with us to make a good faith effort that either individuals are complying or in a business setting, that their customers, their guests and patrons are complying, we're going to generally find that sufficient. I know, at least in our office, when we look at either advising, whether it's the health department or our police officers or others with citation authority, that's what we're looking for. Has that local customer, really, that local resident, made a good faith effort to comply? And usually they have, but unfortunately, sometimes they don't. And if they're simply not making an effort in that direction, and the violation is serious enough, then a citation can be issued. Again, if it's in the city, our office evaluates that, prosecutes it. It goes through a pre-trial where we have an opportunity to talk to folks. And first thing we say out of the gate with them is, what we're really looking for is to make sure you're following this rule for your safety and others. 99% of the time it ends right there and we're able to resolve it. If not, and somebody wants a trial and says, no, we just didn't violate it, we don't see it the way you do, we set that matter for a circuit court trial, and one of our Eau Claire Circuit Court judges hears and decides the case.
So one of the questions that we had gotten in advance was if there was some sort of appeal process that could be created so that a business can keep operating while you work this out. And obviously this would be taking place well before trials and all of that. But, when you're in those first few stages. Tim, you've got your mic open. Maybe you can comment on that.
Well, citation does not require them to close. Citation is a forfeiture. It's a fine. They continue to operate. I'm looking at the county ordinance, and in that county ordinance, there is a provision in there about closing businesses, but the language reads, but only for so long as necessary to stop or suppress the spread of disease, and shall only be in effect until such time as the business has taken the appropriate actions to appropriately sanitize the business and take the appropriate precautions to prevent future spread of disease. So that would mean that essentially they would be closed until they could clean the business adequately and then reopen and take adequate measures to make sure that we're not allowing the spread of disease to occur again. Likely that they would have to follow whatever orders in place if there is one in place. But otherwise, if it's just an issue of they've received a citation and they haven't been required to close to sanitize, they would remain open, and then they would be able to come in and challenge the ordinance if that's what they want to do, or challenge the citation if that's what they want to do in court, like anybody else does that receives a citation.
Okay. And as a community, the word quarantine has been in the news a lot. There's been talk of the Wisconsin Counties Association document with an isolation and quarantine placard in the appendix. They were posted over the community over the weekend, and people seem to be wondering, what does this ordinance mean for things like quarantine and forcing someone to stay in their home or leave their home if they're sick? Tim or Steve?
Well, quarantine and isolation are really directed at individuals, and those are people that have been exposed in the instance of quarantine. You typically are ordered to quarantine if you've been exposed to somebody who's known to have communicable or infectious disease. Isolation is when you're actively infected with the individual. Those are directed at the individual to isolate them so that they're not spreading the disease within the community. This ordinance really isn't addressing quarantine and isolation. What it's addressing is how the health officer would create orders in the community, most likely for general application in the community.
Okay, and if I
Related
can-
question, if I might, while we just have a few minutes, vaccination has also come up often and was also in our chat box. Tim, can you speak to whether vaccination is required by this ordinance?
No, it is not. Vaccination is something that's regulated by the state. It's not something that we would require at the county level. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. Audrey, do you have any additional questions that may have come in last minute or from the Q&A box?
Yes, I've got a question a little bit about, as we were talking about legislative oversight, which of course means our city council and our county board. So there was a question about whether they need to vote every time that an order would come before them, or if there could be a no vote option and then the order is allowed to continue. Maybe you can just touch on the process or the timeline of orders and voting by those elected officials.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. The ordinance, if adopted in its current format, authorizes action promptly by the local health officer if they follow the specific standards, right? So it does not require legislative action every time out. Otherwise, that would really be a direct legislative option model. So instead, this ordinance, if adopted, would authorize the prompt immediate emergency response based on the specific conditions of the health emergency. And they could be effective for up to 30 days as authorized by this ordinance. If they are going to be extended beyond 6 months, there would need to be additional legislative authority to extend them beyond that time frame. They could be extended as long as a year. And those are the necessary legislative expansions of time frame within which an order could apply. However, if there is an order issued, even after day one, that either the city council or the county board thinks is contrary in their legislative judgment to the community's health, safety, and welfare, they have the opportunity to put it on an upcoming agenda, ask the important questions based on their constituent input and feedback as to why that order is in place, and then would be required to take a vote. And if it does not pass, if they don't get a majority vote to sustain that order, it would become advisory. So up front, there is authorization and the ability to take emergency action. They have to be in 30-day increments up to no more than 6 months. And that could happen, yes, without legislative specific action. However, right from day one, there is the opportunity for legislative action to say, hey, time out, we don't like that order, or we don't think it should be mandatory, it should only be advisory. It's on the next agenda. If it doesn't get a majority vote, which is what is required to pass any ordinance, it stops being a rule that's enforceable in our community and becomes simply advisory.
Anything else, Audrey?
I'll say there are a number more, but I think we'll have to provide those answers afterward.
Okay.
In the interest of time, I know we've got another slide to get to.
Sure. We will be collecting these Q&As and adding to what you can find on the website. You can go to the city website, eauclairwi.gov, and find that under the local latest news. You'll find more information there. So with that, we will wrap up our Q&A. We'll be adding to that FAQ based on the conversation that we've had here tonight. But now we're going to turn it over to Dale and Catherine for some final comments.
Thank you. I think that the community is at a crossroads, and we as a community are asking, what process do we want to use to respond to a highly contagious novel virus that sickens and in some cases could be even fatal to our residents?
And as we've talked about this, this evening, really for the last 7 months as a community, what we've done is we've chosen to provide leadership using an order and an order process. And through the expertise of our local health department and in collaboration with our partners, we've had a community response to this virus. And it's been work that has resulted in a lower fatality rate and a lower spread of infection when you compare the Eau Claire community to other communities. But now, as has been outlined, we've got a choice that we have to make. And it's really a pretty clear choice. We either move to essentially advisory orders, right? So we're only making recommendations to the community on things that have community-wide impact. Or we have orders that the community-wide impact have to be done by direct legislation. So everything that would happen related to the communicable disease of community-wide application would have to be legislated at the local level. Or the third option, which is what's being proposed for both the City Council and the County Board to consider, is to put in place an ordinance like the one that's drafted that would provide a solution to respond locally to a highly contagious disease. It would respect individual, business, and community rights. It's an ordinance that would allow our trained health professionals to lead the community, but within a narrow set of circumstances that are defined within the city and the county code with an emergency response. And it would include a defined process, public feedback, local enforcement, and city council and county board oversight. Those are really where we're at with our crossroads. And again, we're here because of circumstances that were really outside of our control at the state level. And this is the best legal advice that we have if we want to find this middle ground and have an ordinance that does allow us to respond locally with the health officer leading, but again, providing the public feedback, local enforcement, and the county board and city council oversight.
Some of the things that I've heard, not only this evening, but in other comments, that really hit home for me is that we really all share in many ways the same goals. We want to have healthy individuals and people. We want thriving business. We want a vibrant community life. And the conversation we're having this evening is an important policy conversation about a proposed ordinance and one of several paths forward. It's a choice in how we as a community are going to respond as we move forward. And I want to thank this online team today for the work that they've put into sharing this information, and also to express our appreciation to those who have chosen to take the time to join us this evening and to hear some of the answers to the questions that have been raised. We know that public policy decisions are better made with good input, conversation, and accurate information. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. On the screen, we're sharing some of the dates that are still yet to come in the process. You can see the arrow that is pointing to this evening's meeting. The next meeting is coming up on Monday, October 12th at 7 p.m. and that is when the City Council will receive public comment. Then on Tuesday, October 13th, the City Council will vote on the proposed ordinance. Last night, the County Board of Supervisors had its first reading of the ordinance, and so then on Tuesday, October 20th at 7 p.m., the County Board will vote. Again, both websites have information regarding the ordinance and the frequently asked questions. So I would encourage you to utilize those resources if you have questions that are not answered by the FAQs. And I think, Tess, you had a few things that you still wanted to share on behalf of our group today.
Just again, that you can easily find that link to the latest news if you go to our website at eauclairewi.gov, scroll down to the bottom, and you'll find a list of more information, those FAQs. And this meeting, again, has been recorded and will be available hopefully as soon as tomorrow for you to be able to watch again, review if you want to, and we'll include as soon as possible the additional questions that came from today. Again, we want want to thank you all for joining us on a WebEx meeting, or if you're listening by phone. And thank you all of the panelists for joining us tonight and helping shed some light on this important question. We do appreciate an engaged community, and thank you for your time tonight. Good night.
Thank you.